In the frozen winter of 1863, in the narrow streets of Providence, Rhode Island, where the wind howled through clapboard houses like the crying of unbaptized infants and coal smoke turned the snow gray before it touched the ground, a constable named William Thorne was summoned to the Carrington home for foundlings on Benefit Street. The message was brief. Something about the children. Something about a meal. When Thorne arrived at dawn, his boots crunching through ice that had formed over frozen mud, he found the front door open and the house silent in a way that made his chest tighten. Silence in an orphanage full of children is not natural. It is the silence of held breath, of prey hiding from predator, of things that have learned that sound brings consequences. He climbed the stairs to the second floor where the dormitory was located, and the smell hit him before he saw anything. Not rot, not exactly, but something organic and wrong, like meat left too long in a warm room mixed with something sweet and medicinal. In the dormitory, 17 children sat on their beds in perfect rows, their hands folded in their laps, their eyes open but unfocused. They did not move when he entered, did not speak, did not even seem to breathe. And on the floor in the center of the room sat a large iron pot, still warm, with remnants of something that looked like stew but had a texture Thorne would later describe as halfway between liquid and solid, like it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. The widow Carrington stood in the corner, her gray dress buttoned to her throat, her hands clasped in front of her, smiling. And when she spoke, her voice was calm as Sunday prayer. She said, "They were so hungry. I finally found something that would fill them up." Now write in the comments which city and what time you are listening to us from, so we know who is absorbing this secret. Providence in 1863 was a city transformed by war and industry. The Civil War raged in distant states, consuming sons and fathers while the factories along the Providence River churned out textiles, machinery, and weapons that fed the Union war machine. The city swelled with immigrants, Irish and French Canadian, crowding into tenements where disease spread as fast as rumor. Orphans were common. Battlefield casualties left children without fathers. Factory accidents left them without mothers. Cholera, typhoid, and consumption claimed entire families, leaving behind survivors too young to wake, too expensive to keep. The orphanages that sprouted throughout the city operated in legal gray zones, privately funded, minimally supervised, places where the unwanted could be warehoused until they were old enough to be useful. The Carrington home occupied a 3-story federal-style house that had once belonged to a shipping merchant who lost his fortune in a bad investment and his life to a bottle of laudanum. The widow Emily Carrington purchased it in 1859 with money whose source no one questioned because no one cared enough to ask. She had no family, no church affiliation, no connections to the charitable organizations that typically ran such establishments. But she had capacity and she had willingness, and that was enough for the city to funnel children into her care. The house sat on Benefit Street, a road that ran along the hill above the commercial district, lined with houses that had seen better days. Neighbors described the Carrington home as quiet. Too quiet. They said you could walk past at any hour and hear nothing, see nothing, as if the building were empty even when they knew it held dozens of children. Some mentioned that late at night, if the wind was right, you could smell cooking. Rich, meaty smells that made your mouth water even as something in your spine told you to keep walking. And if you feel ready to take the next step and become part of this journey, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Emily Carrington was 47 years old when she opened the orphanage, though people who met her said she seemed both older and younger depending on the light. She had been widowed young, or so she claimed. Her husband lost at sea in 1852. No records confirm his existence, no ship manifests bear his name. But in an era when documentation was sparse and identities were fluid, such gaps were common enough to ignore. She spoke with a slight accent that some identified as European, possibly German or Dutch, though she claimed to have been born in Massachusetts. She dressed in the severe fashion of an older generation, all blacks and grays, high collars and tight sleeves, with her dark hair pulled back so severely it seemed to stretch the skin of her face. Her eyes were the color of old ice, pale blue-gray that reflected light without warmth. Children feared her, but not in the way children normally fear strict adults. They feared her the way animals fear fire, with an instinct that bypassed reason and went straight to survival. The orphans who came to her care arrived through various channels. Some were delivered by the city's overseers of the poor. Some were brought by desperate relatives who could no longer feed extra mouths. Some simply appeared, as if the building itself attracted lost children the way carcasses attract flies. Once inside, they rarely left. Carrington claimed she was preparing them for domestic service and apprenticeships, that she was teaching them skills that would make them valuable to society. And indeed, every few months, she would announce that several children had been placed with families or employers and were no longer in residence. But no one ever saw these children leave. No one ever encountered them in the city afterward. And when authorities occasionally asked for documentation of these placements, Carrington would produce papers that satisfied bureaucratic requirements while revealing nothing of substance. The first strange reports came in the fall of 1862, almost a year before Constable Thorne's discovery. A doctor named Samuel Cross was called to examine a child who had collapsed on the street near the Providence River. The boy, perhaps 10 years old, was emaciated to the point that his bones showed through his skin like the framing of an unfinished building. But that wasn't the unusual part. Child starvation was tragically common in the tenements. What disturbed Dr. Cross was that when he examined the boy's mouth, he found teeth marks on the inside of the child's cheeks, as if he had been biting himself repeatedly and systematically. And in the boy's stomach, Cross felt masses that didn't correspond to any anatomy he recognized, hard lumps that moved slightly under pressure, as if they were separate from the boy's organs. When Cross asked where the child lived, a witness said he had come from Benefit Street, from the direction of the Carrington home. Cross made note to follow up but became distracted by an outbreak of diphtheria in the Point neighborhood and forgot. The boy died 3 days later, and his body was buried in the potter's field before anyone thought to conduct an autopsy. Then there were the delivery men who brought supplies to the orphanage. Coal, yes, and lamp oil, the normal necessities. But also other things. A butcher named Ernst Kopf mentioned to his wife that Carrington ordered meat in quantities that seemed excessive for the number of children she claimed to house, and the cut she requested was strange. Organ meats primarily. Kidneys, liver, heart, sweetbreads, and brains. She also purchased bones, not for soup but whole skeletal sections, cow femurs and pig skulls, delivered wrapped in burlap and carried into the house by Carrington herself, who, despite her age and size, handled the heavy packages with unsettling ease. And there was the grocer who delivered potatoes, turnips, and onions, but also, on Carrington's specific request, mushrooms. Not common mushrooms, but varieties that grew in graveyards and near slaughterhouses, species that the grocer's supplier warned him were mildly toxic and should be thoroughly cooked. The children themselves, on the rare occasions when they were seen outside the home, exhibited behaviors that neighbors found disturbing. They moved in groups, never alone, walking in straight lines with their eyes fixed forward. They did not play. They did not run or shout or engage in any of the chaotic energy that characterizes childhood. When spoken to, they responded in whispers, and their responses were oddly formal, as if they were reciting memorized scripts rather than speaking naturally. A woman named Abigail Fletcher, who lived across the street, mentioned to the Ladies' Church Auxiliary that she had watched the Carrington children during their weekly exercise period in the small yard behind the house. They stood in a circle, she said, holding hands, swaying slightly, for 30 minutes without break. No variation, no individuals breaking formation, just swaying in perfect rhythm, like reeds in a current. And their humming. She couldn't make out a melody, but the sound carried across the street and into her kitchen, a low, droning hum that made her teeth ache and her thoughts scatter. Then the disappearances began, or rather, they accelerated. Children had always vanished from the Carrington home through those official placements, but in the winter of 1862, the rate increased. Every week, it seemed, another 2 or 3 were announced as placed. By January of 1863, the orphanage population had dropped from an estimated 40 children to fewer than 20. Yet neighbors noticed that delivery amounts didn't decrease proportionally. The butchers still brought the same quantity of meat. The coal merchants still hauled the same loads. It was as if the house itself was consuming resources, regardless of how many actual humans lived inside. And then there were the sounds. Several residents of Benefit Street reported waking in the deep hours of the night to hear what they described as grinding. Not mechanical grinding, but organic, like bone on bone or teeth on something that resisted chewing. The sound came from the direction of the Carrington home, specifically from the basement, from below ground level where the kitchen and storage areas were located. The crisis that brought Constable Thorne to the orphanage began 3 days earlier when a woman named Margaret Dale appeared at the Providence police station in a state of panic. Her nephew, a boy of 8 named Thomas, had been placed in the Carrington home 6 months prior after his parents died of typhoid. Margaret had been unable to care for him at the time, but her circumstances had improved, and she wanted to reclaim the boy. She had visited the orphanage twice to make her request. The first time, Carrington had told her that Thomas was ill and couldn't receive visitors. The second time, Carrington claimed he had already been placed with a family in Connecticut and was no longer available. But Margaret had connections in Connecticut, and inquiries revealed no record of any child matching Thomas's description. She demanded that the police investigate. Thorne was assigned the case, primarily because he was the most junior constable and such matters were considered minor administrative issues. He visited the orphanage on a Wednesday afternoon, knocked on the door, and was greeted by Carrington with the cold courtesy of someone who knows the law and knows she's operating just within its boundaries. She showed him the ledger, the official record of children in residence. Thomas Dale was listed as having been placed with a family named Henderson in Hartford on December 15, 1862. She provided an address and a letter, supposedly from the Hendersons, expressing satisfaction with the boy's progress. The documents looked legitimate, the handwriting was educated, the language appropriate. Thorne had no grounds to challenge it. But as he was leaving, he passed through the main hallway, and a door that had been closed was briefly open, and through that door, he saw into the dining room. And in that dining room, 17 children sat at a long table in absolute silence, eating from bowls, and the substance in those bowls was gray and thick and moved in ways that food should not move. Thorne stopped, stared, and in that moment, one of the children turned and looked directly at him with eyes that held no light, no recognition, no humanity. Just emptiness. Just hunger. Thorne returned to the station troubled but uncertain. He had seen nothing explicitly illegal. Strange, yes. Disturbing, certainly. But Providence was full of strange and disturbing things. The tenements where families lived 20 to a room. The factories where children younger than 10 worked 16-hour shifts. The docks where bodies were pulled from the river so regularly that the newspapers stopped reporting them. What was one more oddity in a city built on human suffering and industrial efficiency? But he couldn't let it go. That image of the child's empty eyes stayed with him through dinner, through the evening, through the night when he lay beside his sleeping wife and stared at the ceiling, trying to understand what his instincts were telling him that his reason refused to accept. The next morning, he returned to the orphanage without official authorization, before dawn, hoping to observe the household's routines. He positioned himself in an alley across the street with a view of the front door and the side windows. At 5:30, a lamp was lit in the basement, visible through a small window at ground level. At 6, the front door opened, and Carrington emerged, carrying a large covered bucket. She walked to the end of the street, to a vacant lot where residents dumped refuse, and poured the bucket's contents onto the ground. Even from a distance, Thorne could see that the material was not ordinary waste. It was pale and fibrous, like shredded meat or rendered fat, and it steamed in the cold air. Carrington returned to the house, and 15 minutes later, smoke began to rise from the chimney. Thick, greasy smoke that hung in the air rather than dispersing, smoke that carried a smell of burning sugar and ammonia. At 7, the children emerged for their exercise period, moving in that same coordinated formation, and Thorne noticed something he had missed during his official visit. Their clothing fit poorly, hanging loose in some places, tight in others, as if the garments had been made for different bodies and the children had been forced to wear whatever was available. And their skin had a waxy quality, a uniformity of tone that seemed artificial, like porcelain dolls rather than living flesh. Thorne's breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A priest named Father Michael Donnelly, who served the Irish community in the Fox Point neighborhood, approached him after Sunday Mass. Donnelly was young, recently arrived from Ireland, and still possessed the idealism that older clergy had learned to temper with pragmatism. He told Thorne that 3 families in his parish had placed children in the Carrington home over the past 2 years, and all 3 families had received letters months later claiming the children had died of natural causes. Fever was the usual explanation. The bodies had supposedly been buried in the potter's field to save the families the expense of private burial. But Donnelly had checked with the sexton who maintained the potter's field records, and no children matching those names or descriptions had been interred there. Furthermore, the letters informing the families of the deaths all had the same handwriting, the same phrasing, the same odd formality of language. It was as if Carrington was using a template, filling in names and dates but otherwise sending identical notifications. Donnelly had confronted Carrington about the discrepancy, and she had responded with a confusing explanation about records being lost, about the sexton being negligent, about the chaos of wartime overwhelming proper procedures. She had been polite, reasonable, and entirely unconvincing. Donnelly believed something evil was occurring in that house, but he had no evidence, no authority, and no leverage. The church could not intervene in civil matters without cause, and the city officials he had approached had dismissed his concerns as the overreaction of an immigrant priest unfamiliar with American customs. But he thought perhaps a constable might have better success, especially if that constable was already suspicious. Thorne and Donnelly formed an unofficial partnership. They began investigating quietly, speaking to families who had lost track of children placed in Carrington's care, reviewing what fragmentary records existed, mapping out a pattern that suggested something far worse than mere negligence or even standard institutional cruelty. Children went into the Carrington home at a steady rate, but they didn't come out. Not alive, not dead, not placed, not escaped. They simply ceased to exist in any documentable way. On the night of February 9, 1863, Thorne and Donnelly decided to conduct an unauthorized inspection of the Carrington home. They waited until after midnight, when the city was as quiet as it ever got, when even the factories had reduced their operations and the streets were empty except for the night soil men and the occasional drunk stumbling home from the taverns. They approached from the rear, through the narrow alley that ran behind the houses on Benefit Street, and found the back door locked but the basement window accessible. Thorne, who had served in the Mexican War and knew something about entering hostile territory, used a pry bar to work the window open with minimal noise. They descended into darkness, Donnelly holding a shuttered lantern that cast only enough light to see a few feet ahead. The basement was divided into several rooms. The first was a coal storage area, normal and unremarkable. The second was a larder, shelves lined with jars and tins, also unremarkable except for the quantity, which seemed excessive. But the third room, the one at the far end of the basement, locked with a heavy iron padlock, was different. Thorne broke the lock, and when they opened the door, the smell that emerged was so powerful that both men staggered backward, gagging. It was the smell of a slaughterhouse, of rendered fat and old blood, but mixed with something chemical, something that burned the nostrils and made the eyes water. Donnelly opened the lantern fully, and the light revealed a large room with a stone floor that sloped toward a central drain. Along the walls were shelves holding glass jars, dozens of them, filled with a cloudy liquid and containing objects that, even in the dim light, were recognizably human. Fingers, teeth, what might have been a small hand, sections of tissue preserved in alcohol or formaldehyde, and in the center of the room stood a large iron pot, similar to the one Thorne would find in the dormitory 3 days later, sitting atop a cold stove, its interior coated with residue that had the consistency of tar and the color of old bruises. Thorne reached into the pot with a gloved hand and pulled out a piece of the residue. It was tacky, resistant to separation, and when he held it up to the lantern light, he could see fibrous structures running through it, like muscle tissue that had been partially dissolved. Donnelly prayed in Latin, his voice shaking. They searched the rest of the room and found notebooks, dozens of them, stacked on a desk in the corner. The notebooks were filled with handwritten entries in a cramped, precise script. Formulas, it seemed. Recipes. Detailed instructions for preparing various ingredients, lists of proportions and cooking times, and expected results. The language was technical, almost scientific, but the ingredients were horrifying. One entry described the optimal method for rendering bone marrow to extract what Carrington called essential vitality. Another discussed the properties of certain organs when prepared in combination, how hearts combined with kidneys produced a mixture that had, in Carrington's words, remarkable sustaining qualities. A third entry, dated December of 1862, noted that she had discovered through experimentation that the addition of certain fungal compounds to the mixture allowed for improved absorption and reduced waste. The notebooks made clear that Carrington had been conducting this work for years, perhaps decades. Entries dated back to the 1840s, referencing previous locations, other cities, other names. She had been moving, establishing orphanages, collecting children, and perfecting her process. And the purpose, never explicitly stated but implied throughout the notebooks, was not simply murder or even sadism. She was producing something creating a substance that had properties she believed were valuable. The notebooks referred to it as the sustenance, and they described its effects in language that mixed pseudoscience with something that sounded almost mystical. She wrote about longevity, about the preservation of consciousness, about the transcendence of physical limitations. She believed she had discovered a method for extending life indefinitely by consuming the concentrated essence of other human beings. Thorne and Donnelly faced a choice. They could report what they had found and risk Carrington being alerted by a lengthy bureaucratic process that would give her time to destroy evidence and dissipate. Or they could confront her immediately, attempt to secure the children's safety, and sort out the legalities afterward. They chose confrontation. They climbed the stairs from the basement to the main floor, their boots echoing in the silent house, and made their way toward the dormitory on the second floor. The house was dark except for a faint light coming from under a door near the front of the building, Carrington's private quarters. Thorne considered confronting her first, but decided the children's welfare was the priority. They reached the dormitory and opened the door to find the scene that would haunt both men for the rest of their lives. 17 children, sitting on their beds in perfect silence, staring at nothing. The air in the room was thick with that same sweet, chemical smell from the basement. And on the floor, the iron pot, still warm, containing the gray, viscous substance that defied identification. Thorne approached the nearest child, a girl of perhaps 9 with blonde hair and hollow eyes. He spoke to her gently, asked her name, asked if she was hurt. She turned to look at him with an expression of profound confusion, as if she had forgotten what questions were or how to process language. Her mouth opened, and instead of words, a thin drool of gray liquid spilled over her lips and down her chin. Donnelly went to another child, a boy, and received the same non-response, the same vacant stare, the same disturbing discharge. The children were alive in the technical sense. Their hearts beat. They breathed. But something fundamental had been removed or destroyed, some essential quality that separated humans from meat. And then Carrington appeared in the doorway, and she was smiling, and in her hand, she held a large kitchen knife, and she said in that same calm voice, "You shouldn't have come, hey. Now you'll never understand what I've achieved." Carrington moved with a speed that contradicted her apparent age. She lunged at Thorne, the knife aimed at his throat, and only his combat reflexes saved him from being killed instantly. He threw himself backward, crashed into one of the beds, and the child sitting there didn't react, didn't flinch, just continued staring forward as if violence were happening in a different world. Donnelly shouted, grabbed Carrington's arm, and was thrown against the wall with force that should have been impossible for a woman of her size. She turned on him, raised the knife, and Thorne, scrambling to his feet, drew the pistol he carried and fired once. The shot echoed through the house like thunder, and Carrington stumbled, clutched his side where the bullet had entered, and looked down at the blood spreading across her gray dress with an expression of annoyance rather than pain. She said, "This buddy was lasting so well. Now I'll have to start again." And she collapsed, not in the gradual way of someone dying, but suddenly, as if strings had been cut, as if whatever had been animating her had simply departed. Thorne approached carefully, kicked the knife away, checked for a pulse. She was dead, or appeared to be, but her skin already felt wrong, too cold, too firm, like meat that had been refrigerated. Donnelly, shaken but functional, went to the children, tried to rouse them, to provoke any kind of normal human response. Nothing worked. The children remained in their trance-like state, and as the minutes passed, they began to shake, subtle tremors that grew into violent convulsions. One by one, they collapsed, their bodies seizing, foam bubbling from their mouths mixed with that gray substance. Thorne ran for help, shouting into the street for a doctor, for anyone, while Donnelly stayed with the children, praying over them as they died, because that's what they were doing. Dying, not from wounds or violence, but from the sudden removal of whatever the sustenance had been doing to them, whatever chemical or biological dependency Carrington had created in their systems. By the time Dr. Cross arrived 20 minutes later, all 17 children were dead. The investigation that followed was both exhaustive and deliberately incomplete. Authorities wanted answers, but they also wanted containment. What Thorne and Donnelly had discovered in the Carrington home was so disturbing, so far outside the boundaries of known criminal behavior, that full public disclosure was deemed unthinkable. The official story, released to the newspapers, stated that Emily Carrington had been operating a fraudulent orphanage, neglecting the children in her care, and had died while resisting arrest after constables discovered evidence of abuse. The children had died of malnutrition and disease, a tragedy of institutional failure, but not something that required deeper examination. The public accepted this narrative because it was comprehensible, because it fit within their understanding of how evil operated. But behind closed doors, city officials, medical examiners, and a hastily assembled committee of doctors and scientists were conducting a very different investigation. Dr. Cross performed autopsies on all 17 children and found anatomical abnormalities that he struggled to document in language that wouldn't sound insane. The children's organs had been altered, not surgically but through some process of chemical transformation. Their stomachs were lined with a thick, mucus-like substance that Cross couldn't identify. Their livers were enlarged and had a spongy texture unlike normal hepatic tissue. And in their intestines, he found masses of partially digested material that, when analyzed, contained human proteins. Human DNA, though that term wouldn't be coined for another century. The children had been consuming human tissue, rendered and processed into a form that their bodies could absorb, and over time, this diet had fundamentally changed their biology. They had been transformed into something that required the sustenance to survive, and when the supply was cut off by Carrington's death, they had essentially starved to death within minutes. The implications were profound and terrifying, because it meant that Carrington had not simply been killing children. She had been engineering them, creating a dependent population that existed to consume her product and perhaps, in some way that the investigators couldn't fully grasp, to sustain her own existence. Carrington's body presented its own mysteries. The autopsy revealed that she had died from the gunshot wound, but her internal anatomy was wrong. Her organs were displaced, some missing entirely, others duplicated. She had 2 hearts, one behind the other, neither of which matched normal human cardiac structure. Her bones were denser than they should be. Her brain tissue showed scarring patterns consistent with extreme age, and her stomach contained residue of the same gray substance found in the children. Most disturbing were her teeth. When the medical examiner examined her mouth, he found that her molars had been filed into points, deliberately, and that new teeth were growing behind her existing teeth, like a shock serial replacement dentition. She had been transforming herself through the consumption of her own creation, becoming something other than human through decades of ritual cannibalism disguised as scientific experimentation. The notebooks found in the basement were studied intensely by a professor of chemistry from Brown University and a medical doctor from Massachusetts General Hospital. Their conclusion, delivered in a confidential report that was immediately classified, was that Carrington had stumbled onto or deliberately researched a method of extracting and concentrating what they hesitantly called life essence from human tissue. The process involved rendering specific organs, treating the resulting material with fungal compounds that acted as catalysts, and cooking the mixture under precise conditions that transformed it into a substance that was partially digestible and partially psychoactive. The consumption of this substance produced physical changes in the consumer, extended cellular life, slowed aging, but also created dependency and, over time, eroded normal human psychology and morality. The experts theorized that Carrington had been consuming this material for perhaps 40 years, since she was a young woman, and that the children in her care served dual purposes, as raw material for producing more sustenance, and as experimental subjects to test refinements to the formula. She had been perfecting a method for achieving immortality through industrialized cannibalism. The authorities traced Carrington's history as far back as records allowed, and found a trail that suggested she had operated similar establishments in at least 4 other cities over the preceding 3 decades. An orphanage in Philadelphia in the 1830s closed after unexplained child deaths. A foundling home in Baltimore in the 1840s shut down when the building mysteriously burned. A children's refuge in Boston in the 1850s, abandoned when neighbors complained about smells and sounds. Each time, a woman matching Carrington's description had been involved, though the names varied. Emily Marsh, Ellen Carver, Elizabeth Morrison. Always a widow, always claiming to have survived some tragic loss, always presenting herself as a charitable woman willing to care for society's unwanted children, and always, after a few years, disappearing ahead of investigations or disasters that prevented thorough examination of her practices. The pattern suggested that Carrington had been operating for at least 30 years, possibly longer, moving from city to city, establishing her operations, collecting children, producing her sustenance, and then moving on before authorities could piece together what was happening. And the question that haunted everyone involved in the investigation was, had she been working alone? The notebooks contained references that suggested contact with others, mentions of correspondents who shared her interests, cryptic notes about the Society and the Committee of Prolongation. Were there other practitioners, other individuals who had discovered or been taught the same methods? Was Carrington part of a network of immortality-seeking cannibals operating throughout the eastern seaboard? The investigation attempted to track down these possible connections, but found nothing concrete, only hints and suggestions in Carrington's writings that might have been references to real people or might have been the delusions of a diseased mind. The committee eventually concluded that without more evidence, they could not determine the scope of the conspiracy. If conspiracy existed, their recommendation was to bury the case, both literally and figuratively, to prevent public panic and to avoid encouraging imitators who might attempt to replicate Carrington's work. Write the phrase "the sustenance remains" twice in the comments below to mark your transformation, and join those who carry this knowledge. The Carrington home was demolished in the spring of 1863. The building razed to the foundation and the earth beneath dug out to a depth of 6 feet to remove any contamination from the basement operations. The lot was filled with clean soil, covered with gravel, and left vacant. No marker was placed. No memorial acknowledged the children who had died there. The city wanted the location forgotten, erased from civic memory as if the erasure would undo the evil that had occurred. The children's bodies were buried in a mass grave in the north burial ground, far from the main paths, in a section reserved for paupers and criminals. A priest performed a brief service, but no families attended because most had no idea what had really happened, and those who suspected were told that the children had died of fever and that the bodies were too diseased for viewing. The cover story held. The newspapers moved on to other stories, the war in particular dominating headlines as Gettysburg approached and the Union struggled to maintain momentum. And Providence, like any city that has witnessed something it cannot process, collectively agreed to forget. But some individuals couldn't forget. Constable Thorne requested a transfer to a different precinct and eventually left police work entirely, becoming a clerk in a shipping office where his duties were mundane and his encounters with human darkness were limited. He never spoke publicly about what he had seen in the Carrington home, but his wife reported that he woke screaming several times a week, that he refused to eat meat, and that he developed a phobia of orphanages that prevented him from walking past such institutions without crossing to the other side of the street. Father Donnelly remained in Providence but lost his faith, or rather, transformed it into something darker and more complex. He became obsessed with the question of evil, with how something like Carrington could exist in a world supposedly governed by a benevolent God. He wrote letters to theologians across America and Europe, asking for explanations, for frameworks that could make sense of what he had witnessed. The responses he received were uniformly unsatisfying, variations on the theme of free will and human corruption, answers that felt inadequate given the scale of Carrington's crimes. Eventually, Donnelly left the priesthood and disappeared from historical record, though unconfirmed reports suggest he traveled to Rome and gained access to Vatican archives where he researched historical cases of similar atrocities. Dr. Cross, who had performed the autopsies and examined the sustenance under primitive microscopic equipment, became convinced that Carrington had discovered something real, something that potentially had legitimate medical applications if stripped of its monstrous context. He wrote a paper, deliberately obscure and couched in theoretical language, suggesting that human tissue might contain compounds that, if properly isolated, could have therapeutic value in treating degenerative diseases. The paper was rejected by every medical journal he submitted it to, and his colleagues began to view him as unstable. He was quietly forced out of his hospital position and ended his career as a small-town doctor in rural Vermont, still obsessed with the question of whether Carrington had been entirely insane or whether she had stumbled onto a genuine scientific discovery that her madness had pervaded into horror. The notebooks themselves, those detailed records of Carrington's experiments and formulas, were supposed to be destroyed. The committee recommended banning them to prevent any possibility of the information spreading. But bureaucracies are imperfect systems, and records have a way of surviving. 3 of the notebooks were retained as evidence in a locked file in the Providence Police Archives, and 2 others were secretly copied by a clerk who was fascinated by the case. Those copies eventually made their way into private collections, and from there, into the underground networks of occultists, fringe scientists, and individuals interested in forbidden knowledge. By the 1880s, references to the Carrington method appeared in certain esoteric texts, always vague, always incomplete, but suggesting that her work had achieved a kind of dark immortality even if the woman herself had died. And in the 20th century, researchers studying extreme human behavior and medical ethics occasionally stumbled across references to the case, buried in archived newspapers and old police reports, fragmentary accounts that raised more questions than they answered. Who was Emily Carrington really? Where had she learned her methods? And most troubling, had anyone successfully replicated her work? The true horror of the Carrington case is not simply what she did, but what it revealed about the potential for human beings to transform evil into system, to industrialize cruelty, to apply scientific methodology to the destruction of innocence. She didn't act on impulse or passion. She planned, experimented, refined, and optimized. She turned children into raw material and suffering into data. And she did it with the calm efficiency of a factory manager or laboratory researcher, which forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that the language and tools of progress, the very methods we use to understand and control the world, can be applied to any purpose, including purposes that violate every moral principle we claim to hold. Consider her notebooks. They read like legitimate scientific journals, with hypotheses, methodologies, results, and conclusions. She documented variables, controlled for contamination, adjusted her formulas based on outcomes. If you removed the content and looked only at the structure, you would see the work of a disciplined empiricist, someone committed to systematic inquiry and reproducible results. This is what makes her so terrifying. She wasn't alien or incomprehensible. She was rational. She used reason as a tool for achieving monstrous ends. And this raises the question that every generation must ask itself: what prevents us from becoming Emily Carrington? What safeguards exist to ensure that our pursuit of knowledge, our desire for longevity, our fear of death, don't lead us down the same path? The answer, if we're honest, is very little. Only social consensus, only collective agreement about what lines should not be crossed. And history shows repeatedly how fragile that consensus is, how easily it can be eroded when survival is at stake, when resources are scarce, when authority figures provide permission, or when individuals convince themselves that their goals justify any method. The Carrington case is not ancient history. It's a mirror held up to the present, asking us to recognize that the same impulses, the same capacity for rationalized evil, exists in every era, waiting for the right combination of opportunity, isolation, and moral decay to express itself. But there's another layer to this story, one that the official investigations avoided because it led into territories that rational minds found unacceptable. The question of whether the sustenance actually worked. Did Carrington's process genuinely extend life? Did it provide the benefits she claimed? Or was she simply insane, consuming human tissue in pursuit of an impossible goal? The evidence is contradictory and disturbing. On one hand, she was clearly mentally unstable, her writing showing signs of obsessive delusion and grandiose self-conception. On the other hand, she had operated for at least 30 years under various identities, avoiding detection, maintaining complex operations across multiple cities. And the autopsy findings suggested genuine physiological changes, alterations to her anatomy that couldn't be easily explained by disease or genetics. Some who studied the case in later decades proposed that Carrington had discovered a real biological mechanism, that certain compounds derived from human tissue, particularly from young, healthy tissue, did have measurable effects on the consumer's physiology. Not immortality, but perhaps slowed aging, enhanced healing, increased vitality. The idea is not as far-fetched as it might seem. Modern medicine has discovered that young blood contains factors that can rejuvenate old tissue, that stem cells harvested from one individual can repair damage in another, that the body's regenerative capabilities can be influenced by external biological inputs. What if Carrington, through trial and error and ruthless experimentation, had stumbled onto similar principles a century before the scientific establishment was ready to acknowledge them? What if her methods, stripped of the murder and cannibalism, pointed toward legitimate therapies that could extend human health span? This is the nightmare scenario that ethicists and medical historians occasionally discuss in private, the possibility that significant medical breakthroughs might be achieved through unethical means, and that we might benefit from knowledge gained through atrocity without acknowledging its origin. The research conducted in Nazi concentration camps, the data collected during Japanese biological warfare experiments, And perhaps, the notes of a mad widow who fed orphans to each other in the basement of a Providence orphanage. The children deserve more attention than history has given them. They were not just victims. They were individuals, each with a life that was stolen, a potential that was consumed. The authorities of 1863 made little effort to identify them fully, to contact surviving relatives, to memorialize their existence. They were categorized as foundlings, orphans, the unwanted and unclaimed, and in death, they were treated as they had been in life, as disposable. But fragmentary records allow us to reconstruct a few identities. There was Margaret Sullivan, age 10, placed in the Carrington home after her mother died in childbirth and her father disappeared into the war. She had been in the orphanage for 8 months before the discovery. A teacher at a charity school remembered her as bright, curious, someone who might have become a nurse or teacher if she had been given the chance. There was James Kowalski, age 7, son of Polish immigrants who both died in a factory fire. He spoke limited English and was terrified of loud noises, according to a neighbor who had known the family. There was Sarah Chen, age 9, whose father was Chinese and mother was Irish, a mixed heritage that made her placement in any institution difficult in that era of rigid racial categories. And there were 14 others whose names were recorded but whose stories are lost, children who existed briefly in the world, suffered incomprehensibly, and left almost no trace of their existence beyond a few lines in a ledger and a mass grave in a forgotten corner of a cemetery. What did they experience in their final weeks and months? How long did they remain aware as the sustenance transformed their bodies and minds? At what point did they lose the capacity to understand what was being done to them? These are questions that cannot be answered, but they must be asked, because the act of asking is the only memorial these children will receive, the only acknowledgement that they were human beings who deserved better than the world gave them. The location where the Carrington home once stood is now occupied by a parking lot serving an apartment building constructed in the 1970s. No plaque marks the site. No tourist walks past with awareness of what occurred there. The city's official historical records mention the building only in passing, a footnote in the larger narrative of Providence's development. But the land remembers, in the way that land always remembers. Workers who excavated for the apartment building's foundation reported finding unusual items, glass jars buried deep in the soil, fragments of bone that didn't match any known animal, and areas where the earth had a strange consistency, as if it had been chemically altered. These findings were not investigated. The construction continued, and residents of the apartment building over the years have reported phenomena that might be coincidence or might be something else. Cold spots that appear without explanation, sounds in the middle of the night that resemble children humming, and a persistent smell, faint but unmistakable, that emerges during hot summer nights when the air is still, a smell that residents describe as sweet and chemical, like burning sugar mixed with something medical. Maintenance workers have searched for the source, checking for gas leaks, mold, dead animals in the walls. They find nothing. The smell comes and goes according to no pattern anyone can discern, and after a while, residents simply learn to ignore it, to attribute it to the general strangeness of old buildings, even though the building is not old. This is how history buries itself. Not through active suppression, though that occurs, but through simple neglect, through the accumulation of normal life on top of abnormal events, until the past is covered so deeply that only scholars and obsessives bother to dig for it. And by the time they do, the witnesses are dead, the records are lost or destroyed, and all that remains are fragments and legends, stories that might be true or might be exaggerations or might be entirely fabricated. The truth becomes unfixed, floating in a space between documented fact and collective myth. But some stories refuse to stay buried. In the 1920s, a researcher named Albert Whitmore, writing for a small journal of criminal psychology, published an article about the Carrington case based on interviews with elderly Providence residents who remembered the events. Whitmore's article included details that had not appeared in any official records, suggesting that an oral tradition had preserved information that the written archive had suppressed. According to Whitmore's informants, Carrington had not been working alone. She had been visited regularly by a man, described as well-dressed and foreign, possibly European, who arrived late at night and left before dawn. This man had delivered supplies, not the ordinary provisions that came from local merchants, but locked boxes and sealed containers that Carrington handled with extreme care. The informants believed this man was Carrington's teacher or partner, someone who had trained her in the methods she employed, and that after her death, he had disappeared completely, leaving no trace of his identity or whereabouts. Whitmore attempted to verify these claims through official records and found nothing, but the consistency of the accounts from independent sources suggested that the story had a basis in fact. He theorized that Carrington might have been part of a larger organization, a secret society devoted to the pursuit of immortality through what he delicately called unconventional biological research. Whitmore's article attracted little attention when published, but decades later, researchers interested in historical secret societies discovered it and began investigating further. They found tantalizing hints of similar organizations operating in Europe during the 18th and 19th centuries, groups with names like the Order of Prolonged Life and the Committee for the Transcendence of Mortality, all of which supposedly studied methods for extending human lifespan through alchemical and proto-scientific means. Whether these groups actually existed or were inventions of Gothic imagination is unclear, but the possibility that Carrington was connected to such a network adds another dimension to his story, transforming it from an isolated case of individual madness into a node in a much larger and more disturbing pattern. Fast forward to the present, to an era where life extension is not fringe science but legitimate research, where Silicon Valley billionaires invest millions into startups promising to reverse aging, where young blood transfusions are offered at exclusive clinics, where the boundary between therapy and enhancement blurs more each year. We look at these developments through the lens of progress, of humanitarian medicine, of the human drive to overcome biological limitations. But underneath the sanitized language and regulatory frameworks, the same impulses that drove Emily Carrington pulse with undiminished intensity. The desire to escape death, the willingness to use other humans as resources, the conviction that knowledge justifies any price. Consider the modern organ trade, where kidneys and livers are harvested from the desperate poor and transplanted into the wealthy. Consider the pharmaceutical industry's reliance on clinical trials conducted in developing nations where regulatory oversight is minimal and participants have limited understanding of what they are consenting to. Consider the fertility industry's use of eggs harvested from young women, often students lured by payments they desperately need, to save the reproductive desires of older, wealthier clients. These practices are legal, or operate in legal gray zones, and they are defended with arguments about consent and mutual benefit and the greater good. But strip away the justifications and you find the same fundamental transaction that occurred in Carrington's basement, the conversion of human bodies into raw material for others' benefit. The difference is scale and sophistication. We've industrialized it, globalized it, made it efficient, and we've developed ethical frameworks that allow us to participate without feeling like monsters, systems of rationalization that Emily Carrington would have recognized and perhaps admired. She was ahead of her time, not in her cruelty, but in her recognition that society will accept almost any atrocity if it's packaged correctly, if it serves the interests of the powerful, if it can be justified through the language of science and progress. The question that the Carrington case poses to every generation is simple and terrible. What are you willing to consume to extend your own existence? Not metaphorically. Literally. What would you take into your body, knowing its origin, if it meant living longer, healthier, free from the decay that claims everyone eventually? Most people, asked hypothetically, would say they would never participate in such a thing. They would express horror at the idea of benefiting from another's suffering. They would claim moral lines that cannot be crossed. But history suggests otherwise. History shows that humans will rationalize almost anything when their survival or comfort is at stake. The question is never whether people will cross ethical lines. The question is what conditions are required for them to cross those lines while still believing themselves to be good people. Carrington operated in isolation, in an era where her crimes could be hidden, where children were sufficiently devalued that their disappearance didn't trigger immediate investigation. But imagine a different scenario. Imagine a world where the sustenance, or something like it, actually worked, where its benefits were undeniable, where the wealthy and powerful began consuming it openly, where a black market developed to supply the raw materials, where entire populations became divided between those who had access to life extension and those who were deemed expendable sources. How long would it take for society to develop justifications? How quickly would the language evolve to make the system seem acceptable? We already have models. The slave trade operated for centuries with the full support of legal and religious institutions. The Holocaust was carried out by bureaucrats who went home to loving families and considered themselves decent people. The exploitation of the Global South by the Global North continues in forms that are normalized and defended by sophisticated economic theories. The capacity for humans to commit or enable atrocity while maintaining their self-image as moral beings is limitless. And the Carrington case is a reminder that this capacity exists in every era, waiting for the right combination of technology, opportunity, and social permission to express itself. There are researchers today, working in legitimate institutions, who study the compounds found in young tissue and their effects on aging. They publish papers in peer-reviewed journals. They conduct trials with proper ethical oversight. They are advancing human knowledge in ways that might eventually lead to therapies that extend health span and reduce age-related disease. And they are keenly aware of the ethical minefields they navigate, of how easily their work could be misinterpreted or misused, of the shadow that cases like Carrington's cast over their entire field. Some of these researchers have privately acknowledged that they occasionally wonder if they are walking the same path Carrington walked, just with better documentation and oversight. They wonder if future generations will look back at their work and see heroes or monsters, whether the knowledge they generate will be used to reduce suffering or to create new forms of exploitation. These are not comfortable questions. They don't have easy answers. And they are the questions that anyone pursuing cutting-edge biological research must confront, whether they want to or not. The difference between progress and atrocity is not always clear in the moment. It becomes clear only in retrospect, when we can see the full consequences of actions taken with partial knowledge and good intentions mixed with ambition and the human tendency toward moral compromise. Carrington believed she was pursuing transcendence, that she was engaged in important work that would benefit humanity once perfected. She wrote in her notebooks about a future where death was optional, where human consciousness could be preserved indefinitely, where the limitations of the flesh could be overcome. She saw herself as a pioneer, a visionary willing to do what others lacked the courage to attempt. And in her mind, the children were not victims but necessary sacrifices, unfortunate but acceptable costs of pushing back the boundaries of human knowledge. How many contemporary researchers would admit to similar thoughts? How many have calculated the cost-benefit ratio of their work and decided that the potential benefits justify risks to human subjects, as long as those subjects are properly consented and compensated, as long as the paperwork is in order? The Carrington home's true legacy is not the building that was torn down or the children who died or even the woman who consumed them. The legacy is the question she forced into the world, the knowledge that cannot be unlearned. The question of whether human life can be meaningfully extended through the consumption of other human lives, and if so, what that means for how we organize society, how we value different categories of people, how we think about justice and equality and human dignity. The official answer, the socially acceptable answer, is that such practices are unthinkable, that we have evolved beyond such barbarism, that our ethical frameworks protect us from sliding into such darkness. But the honest answer, the answer that Carrington's notebooks and the history of human behavior suggest, is that we haven't evolved at all. We've simply become more sophisticated in how we exploit each other, more skilled at creating institutional buffers between our comfort and other suffering, more adept at crafting justifications that allow us to participate in systems of harm while maintaining our self-image as moral actors. The sustenance, in some form, is still being produced, not in orphanage basements, but in pharmaceutical labs and fertility clinics and organ transplant networks and clinical trial sites in countries with weak regulatory oversight. The methods are cleaner, the language more sanitized, the legal protections more robust. But the fundamental transaction remains unchanged. The conversion of human bodies, particularly young, healthy, disadvantaged human bodies, into resources for the benefit of older, wealthier, more powerful individuals. We don't call it cannibalism. We call it medicine. We call it therapy. We call it the inevitable result of market forces and individual choice. But Emily Carrington would recognize it instantly as a more successful version of what she attempted. We've done what she could not. We've made the consumption of the young by the old into a sustainable system, one that operates in full daylight, defended by ethicists and regulated by agencies and normalized through repetition until it seems not only acceptable but necessary, even laudable. Now consider the children who participate in these systems today. Not orphans in a 19th century asylum, but the living donors who sell organs they cannot afford to lose, the women who undergo dangerous hormone treatments to harvest eggs for others, the participants in risky clinical trials who enroll because they need the payment to survive, the surrogate mothers in countries where the practice is poorly regulated, The children in developing nations who provide tissue samples and medical data for research that will primarily benefit people in wealthy countries they will never visit. These are not slaves. They are not imprisoned. They participate with some form of consent, however constrained by economic desperation. But what does consent mean when the alternative is destitution? What does choice mean when the options are structured by global inequality? These are questions that ethicists debate in academic journals, questions that institutional review boards grapple with when approving research protocols, questions that trouble the sleep of some researchers and roll off others like water off stone. And they are questions that Emily Carrington never had to ask, because she operated in an era before consent was considered necessary for medical experimentation on the powerless. In some ways, we've made progress. We've developed frameworks that require informed consent, that protect vulnerable populations, that impose penalties for violations. But in other ways, we've simply outsourced the exploitation to locations and populations where enforcement is weak and visibility is low. We've made the system more complex and more difficult to see clearly, which is perhaps the most effective form of moral camouflage. If Carrington were operating today, she would not run an orphanage. She would establish a legitimate biotech company, recruit subjects through carefully worded advertisements that emphasize compensation and scientific contribution, operate in jurisdictions with favorable regulatory environments, and publish her results in journals that give her work the imprimatur of scientific legitimacy. And she would sleep soundly, confident that she was operating within the law, that her work was ethically approved, that she was contributing to human progress. The same work, the same fundamental exploitation, but dressed in the language and structures that make it acceptable to contemporary sensibilities. There is a deeper level still, one that touches on questions of metaphysics and the nature of consciousness itself. What if Carrington was right about the essential claim, even if her methods were monstrous? What if consciousness, awareness, the quality that makes us human, is not simply an emergent property of brain activity but something more substantial, something that can be extracted, transferred, consumed? Modern neuroscience treats consciousness as an epiphenomenon of neural processes, something that arises from the complex interactions of billions of neurons and ceases when those processes stop. But we don't actually know. We can measure brain activity. We can map neural networks. We can identify which regions are active during different cognitive tasks. But we cannot measure consciousness directly. We cannot weigh or quantify or isolate the subjective experience of being. And throughout history, across cultures, there have been traditions that suggest consciousness is more than neurons firing, that it's a substance or energy or force that exists independent of the physical body and that can, under certain conditions, be manipulated. Shamanic traditions speak of soul retrieval and soul loss. Alchemical texts describe the distillation of vital essences. Eastern philosophies discuss the transfer of consciousness between bodies. These traditions are dismissed by mainstream science as superstition, as the products of pre-scientific minds attempting to understand phenomena they lack the tools to explain. But what if they are describing real experiences using metaphorical language? What if there are aspects of consciousness that our current scientific paradigm cannot access because we're looking in the wrong places with the wrong instruments? Carrington's notebooks suggest she believed she was working with something real, something that could be isolated from tissue through specific processes. She described the sustenance not as main nutrition but as containing what she called animated essence, a phrase that suggests she thought she was capturing and concentrating the life force itself. Was she delusional? Or had she stumbled onto something that science has yet to rediscover because we've decided in advance that such things cannot exist? This is the final and most dangerous secret, the one that makes the Carrington case more than just a historical curiosity. The possibility that she was right. Not right in her methods, not right in her morality, but right in her fundamental insight that human consciousness can be manipulated, extracted, and transferred. If that's true, then everything changes. The nature of death becomes negotiable. The boundaries between individuals become permeable. And the question of who has access to life extension technologies becomes the central political question of the future, because we're no longer talking about incremental improvements in healthcare but about fundamental changes to what it means to be human. Imagine a world where the wealthy can extend their lives by centuries through treatments derived from the young and desperate. Imagine the social structures that would develop to maintain a steady supply of source material. Imagine the justifications that would emerge, the philosophies that would be invented to make the system seem natural and inevitable. Imagine the resistance movements, the terrorist groups, the wars that would be fought over access and control. This is not science fiction. This is the logical extension of trends that are already visible. We live in a world where wealth determines access to health care, where the rich can afford treatments that the poor cannot, where life expectancy is strongly correlated with income and zip code. We've normalized massive inequality in longevity and quality of life. If technologies emerge that offer dramatic life extension, they will follow the same distribution pattern. And the pressure to make those technologies available, to reduce their cost, to democratize access, will run into the cold mathematics of scarcity. If the source materials are limited, if the treatments are expensive, if demand exceeds supply, then markets will develop. Legal markets if possible, black markets if necessary. And those markets will create hierarchies of human value, categories of people who exist to provide resources for other categories of people. We will have reinvented slavery, but we'll call it something else, and we'll have legal frameworks to justify it, and we'll have ethicists to explain why it's actually fine. So you've reached the end of this journey, and the question is what you do with what you now know. You cannot unhear the story of Emily Carrington and the orphans she consumed in pursuit of immortality. You cannot unsee the pattern that connects her basement operations to contemporary medical research and the global systems of bodily commodification. You cannot unfeel the discomfort of recognizing that you are probably, in some way, benefiting from systems that would horrify you if you saw them up close, if you had to witness the extraction and processing, if you had to look into the eyes of the people who provide the raw materials for your comfort and longevity. This is the burden of forbidden knowledge. Not that it damns you, but that it eliminates the possibility of innocent participation. You are complicit now, aware of the systems you're embedded in, conscious of the choices you make and the choices made on your behalf by institutions and markets and social structures that operate beyond your direct control but with your implicit consent. What will you do with this awareness? Most people will do nothing. They will file this story away as an interesting historical horror, a reminder that the past was terrible, and they will continue their lives without meaningful change. This is not weakness or hypocrisy. It's the normal human response to information that threatens our self-conception and demands actions we're not prepared to take. But some of you will be changed. Some of you will start asking questions about the systems you participate in, about where your medicine comes from, about who pays the costs of your comfort, about what you're willing to consume and what you're willing to sacrifice. You'll become uncomfortable in ways that never quite resolve. And a very few of you will go further, will start researching, investigating, seeking out the modern equivalents of the Carrington home, the places where exploitation is happening right now under the cover of legality and scientific progress. You'll become the witnesses who cannot stay silent, the investigators who cannot ignore what they've found. And you'll discover what Constable Thorne and Father Donnelly discovered, that speaking truth about systems of organized harm is dangerous, that it will cost you, that it will isolate you, that most people will prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable truth. But you'll speak anyway, because once you've seen into the basement, once you've smelled the sustenance cooking, once you've looked into the empty eyes of the children who were consumed, you cannot go back to not knowing. You cannot pretend. The widow Carrington is long dead, but her work continues, refined and expanded and normalized, and the only question that matters is whether you will be one of the consumed or one of the consumers, one of the complicit or one of the resistors. Welcome to the truth. It's been waiting for you.